The United States was never historically a free trade country. We embraced free trade after the Second World War in order to win the Cold War. The reality was that the world was in ruins and we needed to prop up the economies of foreign nations so that they wouldn't go communist and also bind them to dependence upon ourselves. That's why we embraced free trade. There was never any point at which we discovered miraculously that the policy of protectionism that we had embraced for 150 years was wrong and that free trade was suddenly right. Okay, the reality is that for many, many years, the United States practiced something that it called free trade. In point of fact, we weren't really engaging in free trade. For example, for most of the Cold War, the whole of China was off the market, that is, out of the international market because it was a communist country. So was Russia and Eastern Europe. India was off the market because they were a socialist country. And large sections of the rest of the world, like Latin America, practiced a kind of inward-looking economics that wasn't that interested in exporting. So free trade for the longest time meant the United States, Western Europe, and developed East Asian countries like Japan. Now, of course, the whole world is in the game. One might wonder why, if the U.S. embraced free trade as a Cold War policy, why we didn't give it up when we won the Cold War. And the answer is that we had created, through this policy of free trade, a vast complex of special interests which were now entrenched in power, and they were making so much money from it that they wanted it to continue whether or not it still made any geopolitical sense. America's political leaders haven't responded to these problems for two reasons. The first reason is ideology, particularly a kind of pseudo-libertarian economic philosophy that doesn't seem to notice that the laissez-faire is all on the American side. The other reason, unfortunately, is a lot of these guys have just plain been bought. Possibly the worst effect of increasingly free trade or free one-sided trade in the United States is it enables corporate America, which is, after all, in a capitalist society, the people who are not entirely but largely calling the shots, it enables them to become indifferent to the economic fate of ordinary Americans. Now, if you just think for a second, it's fairly easy to understand why this happens. If corporate America pretty much has to make a profit by selling goods made by Americans to Americans, this means that corporate America has an intrinsic interest in the productivity of Americans and in their ability to consume. Now, productivity plus consumption is prosperity. I mean, that's pretty much all it is. So if you have an economy that's set up that way, then corporate America pretty much wants what the rest of us want. And for decades in this country, from roughly about 1940 to about 1975, there was an arrangement in this country where things were set up that way. It wasn't perfect, but there was, broadly speaking, a structural alignment between what was in the interests of big corporations in this country and what was in the interest of the average American. The main way in which multinational corporations have profited from increasingly free trade in the United States in recent years, and of course, when I say free trade, I don't mean free in both directions, I mean increasingly free imports in the United States, is that it's become easier and easier for them to produce abroad, largely in countries that have lower wages, but also in countries that have aggressive industrial policies on the part of their governments to produce for export to the United States and subsidize exports to the United States. And as a result, they've made out like bandits. They've had increasing profits, remarkably enough, at a time when the rest of the economy has not been doing that well. We've been seeing record profits of Fortune 500 companies, which is a somewhat unusual result. Normally, for most of American history, corporate profits track the overall performance of the economy, but there's been an emerging disconnect there for some decades now.